So I want to lubricate the splines on the input shaft, and I use Moly 60 paste, and I put a little on a toothbrush and then paint the splines with that. I want a thin coat, not a lot, and the nice thing about the Moly 60 is it will stick and won't get thrown off. And that's the other reason you don't want a really big gooey gobs of it, because as the input shaft is spinning, if any of this gets thrown off, it's going to pollute the clutch plates, and that's a mess. You get to take that out and redo it. Okay, I've got a nice even coat on all the splines. So this is the clutch throwout rod, and I just put a thin smear of gear lube 80/90 on here because this end slides through a seal that's on the back end of the input shaft, and I just want to treat the seal kindly. Now it's the end with the little radius here that goes in this way, and I don't get ruthless with it, just there it goes. And then it'll come through on this side like that. Before I install the transmission, I'm going to fill it with 80/90 weight petroleum-based gear lube. I like to use Spectro in particular. The reason for filling it first is then I can spin the output shaft and the input shaft and coat all the bearings and races in there with gear lube. It's a lot easier because I can just upend the transmission on the workbench to do that. I can't really do that as easily after it's installed in the bike, and I'd like to have everything with a good coating of gear lube before the transmission runs for the first time. Since all the gear clusters are mounted in the front face, I've turned the transmission over so the rear is facing up, and then I can rotate the output shaft, which will also turn the other shafts, and that will give a good coating of gear lube on all the gears and bearings. So that probably gets everybody pre-coated. And then I tip it the other way, being careful not to let any gear lube come out of the speedometer shaft hole, and I'll just spin the input shaft, and that will help rotate everything in the back bearings. So just kind of slosh things around a little and make sure they all got coated. Now the other thing I did was put the connections for the neutral switch that are on the sub-harness onto the bottom of the transmission, because it's easier to do that now. To slide the transmission in, you have to pull the whole swing arm assembly back so there's enough clearance. So I used a bungee cord and wrapped it around the rim of the rear wheel and suspended it off the subframe to keep the swing arm pulled back. So I've put sponge foam on the tubes here and on the back tube of the frame to protect it when I swing the transmission in. And I'll hang it on the stud that's in the engine block, and then I'll have to rotate the input shaft on the transmission to get the splines to line up with the clutch splines on the clutch plate. Now I previously centered the clutch plate with a tool before I assembled the clutch, so in theory the transmission shaft and the clutch spline should line right up. So I'm ready to slide the transmission in. I'm going to pick up the wiring harness and just drop it, and then slide it here in between the frame, and then I'm going to hang it off the stud back here There. Now, I have to get the splines on the input shaft to line up with the clutch. So I'm going to test fit it, and if it doesn't quite fit, I stick my finger in and just very gently rotate the input shaft just a little bit, and then retry it until I can get it to slide. Almost. Because you have to get the splines on the input shaft to line up with the splines on the clutch. There. Okay. So it's home. And now what I need to do is put the bolts on the left side, because they're easy to get to. Got that started, and I'll get this one started. I have to kind of jiggle it a little to get them to spin. Okay, so I've got these started, and then I'll put the other ones in on the right side. And when I mate the transmission, I want to be sure there's no gap between the back of the engine bell housing and the front of the transmission, because that has to be dead flat and completely flush. The right bottom bolt runs through. There's a little cutout in the ribbing. You can get a Allen on it, and then the nut is on the inside next to the cylinder pushrod tubes. So you can just tighten it up that way, like that. There's no way to get a torque wrench on there, and it's on the order of 15 foot-pounds, so I kind of make it good and tight like that. And then I look at the seam along the bell housing to the transmission, and that should be flush and tight, which it is. So that means the little tabs that are on the inside of the transmission have slid into the bell housing slots correctly. Now the lower left bolt takes the ground wire with a ring washer and provides the ground through the transmission. And then this is the other wire that goes to the oil pressure sending unit. So while you're installing the transmission, you want to make sure you get those wiring connections installed as well. Now, to tighten this transmission bolt, a standard 6mm Allen, you can't really get it in there because you're bumping into the boss here for the shift lever mechanism. So I took one and cut it down, and then that fits in easily. And like I say, you can't get a torque wrench on there, so it's good and tight is how I like to describe it. After I mount the transmission to the engine block, I need to connect it to the output shaft, and these are the parts used for that. Now there's a boot that goes between the back of the transmission and the swing arm. And on one side of the boot are some markings. There's a long German word here spelled G-E-T-R-I-E-B-E-S-E-I-T-E, which means transmission. And then on the other end is O-B-E-N, which is German for top. So this is the top, and this is the face that goes against the transmission. And then this is the face that goes on the swing arm. Now this is held on by two very large hose clamps, one on each end here. And then To connect the output flange from the transmission to the drive shaft are these 4 bolts, and they've actually been pre-treated with Loctite. So that's how the transmission connects to the drive shaft. So I'm getting ready to connect the drive shaft to the transmission output flange, and I installed the pivot bolts for the swing arm so it's in about the right location, and I've installed the rubber boot with Oben up here, and that lettering points to the transmission, so I have the boot in the right orientation. Now the connection is made with these 4 12-sided bolts, and in my case they came pre-coated with a little Loctite. If yours don't have any, try using a little blue Loctite on them. It's a good insurance policy to keep them from coming loose. Now there's 4 of them, and the yoke has 4 arms, as does the output flange. So you have to line up the hole on the yoke with the hole on the output flange, and then you have to get one of the bolts to get going, and you have to pull the boot out of the way while you do it. So this is a real gymnastics act. I generally can get it to start with 2 fingers and kind of hold it in place, but once I get the first one on, it goes a lot easier. Now it's possible for you, while you're doing that, to have a bolt drop and go down the swing arm tube the drive shaft is in, and that's no fun. But I use a really long magnet, and I can go down the inside of the swing arm, and I can fish that bolt back out again. So it's not the end of the world, but it can be frustrating when they drop on you. Now to tighten up the bolts, I have a screwdriver wrapped in rags that is underneath the swing arm legs and through the cast wheel, so that keeps everything from turning. And then I use a 12-sided wrench, a box, to fit on the nut, and I lean into this until it kind of really hurts and puts a pretty good dent in my hand, and that's probably as tight as they need to be. And then the last thing I like to do is take a paint pen and mark that I have torqued that, so as I go around I won't miss a bolt, and that's a good insurance policy. Now I pulled the boot onto the transmission, and I checked to make sure it's even and tight up against the casting here. And I take apart the hose clamp because it's a lot easier to get the boot and the bolts on without these in your way. So now all I do is just slide it under like that, and basically rotate it around and hook everything together like that. Oh, I have the 2 straps attached, and there's a tab on the back here of the swing arm at the top, and there's a companion on the bottom, and that kind of catches the end of the bellows to help keep it from sliding off the swing arm. So I'm ready to install the speedometer drive cable into the bushing here in the rear of the transmission. Now the bushing is a plastic and has a slot cut through it, which is where the breather bolt, which is the bolt with the hole all the way through it, passes through and keeps it captive. And it also passes through the groove cut here in the bush on the speedometer cable. So assembly is fairly straightforward. Put the bush in with the slot lined up with the hole, and then push the cable in, and it may not go, so rotate the tire a little, which will spin the drive gear for the speedometer, and then they'll slide in. The little square piece on the end of the shaft will slide in. Now the rubber boot slides down over the bush here, and then this bolt goes in. By the way, that bolt has a flat washer, reasonably thick, and a wave washer. So the wave washer is under the head of the bolt. Nothing new about that. And you just basically run this in and tighten it up. And you're good to go. Now you should be able to tighten the bolt with your fingers, and if you can't, then the bushing's not quite aligned correctly. And of course, this does take the ground wire off the battery, which I haven't installed yet. So I'm just going to run this in part way for now, just to make sure it's captured. And then I'll put the cable on later when I get the battery in the bike. These are the parts that go into the clutch throwout mechanism, and it's this mechanism that opens up the clutch plates when you pull the clutch lever. Now there's a throwout lever which has a bearing and a bushing, a bolt, and then a wave washer and nut to lock the bolt, and that mounts into the ears on the back cover of the transmission. Then there's a throwout rod which has a tapered end here, and this is the end that runs into the small hole in the clutch plate, and by pushing the rod is how the clutch plate is opened up. Now the rod connects into this piston bearing combination on the other end, slides in just like that, and then on this end of the piston goes a spring, and then a dust cover goes over the spring. And then there's a clamp to hold the dust cover onto the boss on the back of the transmission. On this end is where the piston and bearing go, and they mate right on the end of the shaft like that. And I just push that back in all the way. And then the spring goes in, and then the rubber cap that holds the spring goes on like that. And then the last thing I'll install is the clamp to hold the cap on. Earlier I showed on the workbench how all the clutch throwout mechanism parts go together inside the rear cover because it was easier to show it. But you have to have those parts out to get the transmission into the frame and hooked up to the engine block. So I've reinstalled all those parts now, and the other part that needs to go in is the lever arm. This is the part that fits inside the little bellows back here, and then the bushing slides in the ears like that, and then the bolt will come through and hold it like that, and then you have a wave washer and a nut that'll go on there to secure the lever arm in the ears here on the back of the transmission. So this is the gear shift lever, which has a pivot bolt and a bushing, and what commonly happens is the bushings get worn. And on this one, there's a fair amount of rock and roll from the worn bushing. Now, you can buy a whole new lever that comes with a needle bearing setup, or you can try to just get by with this. And what I do, which has worked fairly well, is I take beer can aluminum, and the plus on that is you get to drink the beer first. And then I cut out a shim, and what I do is cut out a shim that actually isn't going to fit all the way around. I adjust how much around the circumference the shim goes, And as I increase how much around the shank the shim fits, it tightens up more and more inside the bushing. So I experimentally cut several of them, and this one's just about perfect. And I want to slide this in actually the other way. There we go. And I put a little wheel bearing grease inside the bushing and on the shim. And now that's solid. It's not rocking, and it's free enough spinning that there shouldn't be any resistance to shifting. So a reasonably quick fix to a common problem. Now, when I install the shift lever, it fits in the left front foot peg casting, and it screws in up here, and that hole is threaded. And then this mounts to the rear engine stud. And I've got a new foot rubber that I'll slide on, and I usually use a little Glide, which is a rubber lubricant, to slide them on. And there we go, the new foot rubber's on. Went on very easily with the Glide, which is, I think, spelled R-U-G-L-Y-D-E. It's a common compound for mounting tires because it's basically a lubricant, and then when it dries up, the lubrication disappears. So I'm getting ready to mount the shift assembly, and the lever mounts to the bracket for the left front foot peg, and it mounts on the back using the pivot bolt, and then this is a threaded tapped hole. Now the whole bracket mounts to this hole here with a fairly large M10 bolt designed to be recessed when it fits in. So it goes in like that, and then that's secured with some hardware on the back. Now the linkage is adjustable in length, so you can adjust the shift lever position a little bit. And there's a cup that fits on these ball ends, and there's a little pin that holds the cup on. And the way that works is the pin slides through two holes in the edge of the cup and then swings over and latches into a groove. And that's what keeps the pin captured in the cup. Now the little cups just snap on to the pins. There's a little retaining ring inside. There's one. And there's the other. And then you can make some minor adjustments in the height of the shift lever by adjusting this turnbuckle in the middle. So I'll deal with that later. And then the other thing is you slide the pin, the little retaining clip goes through the two holes, which sometimes is fun to get aligned. There it goes. And then you just snap it down into the groove, and that locks the cup onto the ball. So I've finished installing the transmission. The foot shift linkage is installed, and you'll notice there used to be a red tag on this oil filler bolt for the transmission. I've removed that because I filled the transmission with gear lube. And I've attached the sub-harness that goes to the oil pressure switch and underneath the transmission to the neutral switch. And it has a ground wire that goes to the lower left bolt on the transmission. And both those bolts are tightened. On the back here, I've installed the clutch throwout mechanism with the lever arm, and then all the parts that go inside the rear transmission cover. Now that sub-harness has a wire that goes up and then connects into the main wire harness through a plug here. So that's connected. Over on this side, while I was at it, I installed the other front foot peg, and I attached the output of the transmission to the drive shaft, and the bellows is installed with the hose clamps, and the speedometer drive is installed. Now the lower bolt's been tightened up, but the upper one's still loose, so there's a little red tape on it, and I'll have to use that as part of the mounting of the airbox, which I'll get to later. So it's looking a lot like a motorcycle, and I'm all done on the transmission install.